In the wood-shingled meeting houses of 1830s New Hampshire, a theological civil war was brewing. For decades, the regular Baptists had stood firmly on the bedrock of ironclad Calvinism, but the ground was shifting. To their left, the fiery populist revivalism of Benjamin Randall and his free will movement was stealing their congregants with a message of radical human agency. To their right, the ancient, heavy confessions of their forefathers, like the venerable Philadelphia Confession, felt increasingly like a suit of armor too heavy to wear in a new American republic. The New Hampshire Confession was not just a document, it was a desperate, brilliant attempt to find a middle path through a wilderness of orthodoxy. The landscape of 19th century American theology was defined by this friction. The grinding of inherited scholastic theology against the burgeoning democratic spirit of a new republic. For Baptists, this era was a frantic search for an identity that could bridge the gap between the rigorous, high Calvinism of the colonial period and the revivalistic fervor sweeping across the frontier. At the heart of this theological evolution stands the New Hampshire Confession of 1833. While it may appear as a concise document, its brevity belies a profound strategic effort by men like Baron Stowe and J. Newton Brown to stabilize a denomination in transition. It represents a pivotal shift from the dense traditions of the past toward an evangelical expression of faith. Their goal was a theology that was both sovereign in its view of God and urgent in its call to the sinner, a balance that had never been struck quite like this before. The work of these New Hampshire drafters didn't stay in the North. As the most influential Baptist confession in American history, its legacy extends from those local New England associations directly to the foundational structures of the Southern Baptist Convention. Its DNA lives on in the Baptist faith and message, serving as the doctrinal backbone for millions of believers. It was the document that proved a middle way was not just possible, but powerful. Understanding the New Hampshire Confession requires more than a mere reading of its articles. It demands an investigation into the theological pressures that necessitated its creation. It was a masterpiece of ecclesiastical diplomacy, a delicate balancing act performed to maintain unity without sacrificing orthodoxy. In a world of extremes, J. Newton Brown and his committee found the center, and in doing so, they redefined the Baptist soul forever. The genesis of the New Hampshire Confession was not a pursuit of novelty, but a response to a shifting ecclesiastical climate. In the late 18th century, the religious hegemony of rigid Calvinism in New Hampshire began to fracture. The standing order found itself increasingly out of step with the populist sensibilities of the time. The most significant catalyst for this transition was the rise of the Free Will Baptists under the leadership of Benjamin Randall in 1780. Randall's movement was born from a direct rejection of the doctrine of unconditional election, sparking a theological firestorm across the region. To the Free Will Baptists, the traditional Calvinistic framework seemed to portray God as a cosmic tyrant who demanded obedience from those he had already predestined to fail. They posited that the decision to accept or reject Christ rested fundamentally with the individual. This was a reconfiguration of grace. They argued that while the power to believe was a divine gift, the act of believing was a creaturely responsibility. If a man was to be held responsible for his sin, they argued, he must possess the freedom to choose otherwise. This movement introduced radical practices, open communion, the promotion of women to leadership, and an early vocal protest against the institution of slavery. For regular Baptists, this presented a dual threat to their members and their Reformed identity. The Baptist Convention found itself in a precarious position. On one side stood the Philadelphia Confession, robustly Calvinistic but difficult to reconcile with evangelism. On the other side stood the Free Will Baptists, whose Arminian tendencies were a bridge too far for the orthodox. By the 1830s, the need for a middle way became undeniable. On June 24, 1830, the State Convention officially initiated this process by appointing a committee, including figures like Baron Stowe and Jonathan Going, to draft a statement that would be agreeable and consistent. The creation of the confession was a meticulous, multi-year endeavor. From the initial mandate in 1830 to the lengthy board discussions in late 1832, every word was weighed for its theological implications through a process of rigorous peer review. In January 1833, J. Newton Brown presented the final product, a 16-article document that moved with the agility of the new evangelicalism while remaining anchored in the sovereignty of God. It was promptly published with the authority of the state convention. This was a byproduct of a larger movement toward cooperation, led by men like Luther Rice and Richard Furman. This regional effort in New Hampshire eventually provided the blueprint for the entire American Baptist experience, proving that a confession could be both doctrinally sound and missionally flexible. The true brilliance of the New Hampshire Confession lies in its structural and linguistic subtlety. It was designed to articulate a moderate Calvinism during a period of intense theological controversy. This was a strategic effort to present historic truths in a way that resonated with the burgeoning evangelical sensibilities of the 19th century. The confession begins where all Protestant orthodoxy must, with the authority of the Word. It establishes Scripture as the supreme standard by which all creeds must be tried. It contains the hallmark of Baptist identity, that Scripture has God for its author, salvation for its end, and truth without any mixture of error for its matter. The treatment of human nature in Article 3 is uncompromising, describing humanity as utterly void of that holiness required by the law of God. However, it introduces a crucial nuance. Man is not a sinner by external constraint, but by choice. This distinction addressed the free will Baptist critique that Calvinism made God the author of sin. It preserves the justice of God's condemnation. If Article 3 establishes the problem, Article 4 provides the remedy. Salvation is wholly of grace through the mediatorial offices of the Son of God. In Article 6 of the freeness of salvation, the drafters directly engage the spirit of the age by stating that the blessings of the gospel are made free to all. This was a deliberate pivot away from high Calvinism, which often hesitated to offer the gospel indiscriminately. The confession argues that the only thing preventing the greatest sinner on earth from being saved is their own voluntary refusal. The gospel call is rendered coextensive with the atonement, making salvation possible to all in a moral sense, even while remaining effectual for the elect. Perhaps the most strategic element is the placement of election. Delayed until Article 9, it appears only after the fall, salvation, and regeneration. When election is addressed, it is described as God's purpose of grace, where He graciously regenerates and saves. The framers insisted this choice was perfectly consistent with the free agency of man, proving Calvinism was not a mechanically fatalistic system. By placing regeneration before faith, the confession maintains its reformed roots, asserting that God must act first to enable the heart to believe. It guards against temporary salvation, defining real believers as only those who endure to the end through the perseverance of the saints. Finally, it outlines a distinctly Baptist ecclesiology, a congregation of baptized believers associated by covenant. It identifies only two proper officers, bishops and deacons, and defines baptism strictly as immersion, keeping the church rooted in Baptist tradition. The brevity of the 16 articles was a strategy to create a wider tent, showing that human responsibility and the freeness of the gospel are integral to the biblical witness. Beyond the Granite State. While the New Hampshire Confession was forged in the specific fires of New England theological strife, its destiny was not to remain a local curiosity. For its first 2 decades, it served the specific needs of Northeastern associations, the catalyst of 1853. The mid-19th century acted as a catalyst. In 1853, J. Newton Brown leveraged his position at the American Baptist Publication Society to give the confession a second life. Brown's revision. Brown revised the text, adding 2 key articles to bring the total to 18, and included it in his influential manual, which became the primary vehicle for the confession's spread: organic adoption. Because Baptists lacked a centralized hierarchy, adoption happened organically. Local pastors and deacons used these manuals to establish the common law of Baptist doctrine across the continent, the unlikely ally, the landmarkers. One of the most intriguing successes was its ability to bridge hostile factions. Landmarkers like J.M. Pendleton adopted it enthusiastically, finding its focus on the local congregation perfect for their emphasis on autonomy, the frontier revival. On the American frontier, the confession's modified approach was highly attractive. It allowed revivalists to preach with urgency while maintaining a formal link to their Reformed heritage. The common standard. It provided a common standard that offered a unifying identity during a century of rapid expansion, creating space for cooperation without requiring total uniformity. The most enduring legacy is found in the Southern Baptist Convention. In 1925, facing the modernist controversy, the SBC turned to the New Hampshire document as its primary source material. Reborn as the Baptist faith and message, the document has seen many revisions. Yet even in 2000, the linguistic DNA of the 1833 New Hampshire document regarding election remains virtually unchanged. As the confession moved through history, the language of leadership shifted. This evolution highlights the Baptist tradition of treating bishop, elder, and pastor as interchangeable titles for a single office. Today, it remains arguably the most important Baptist confession ever penned in America, a respected, though non-binding, compass for Christian belief across the globe. The confession was born to balance divine sovereignty with human agency. Reflect on your own path. Do you see it as a series of sovereign appointments or a canvas painted by your choices? Where in your life are you currently seeking a middle path through a wilderness of conflicting ideas? Like the drafters of 1833, how do you navigate the tension of conviction and freeness? If you've enjoyed this deep dive, the journey doesn't end here. On Theology Today, we bring these dusty manuscripts to life through immersive storytelling and expert analysis. Join our community of history enthusiasts. Explore the why behind the faith and the theological civil wars that built the modern church. Click here to subscribe and hit the bell.